Something exciting is happening. Many Jews today feel the need for revitalized Judaism. People are searching for a more vital and authentic mode of Jewish expression, and more than ever we need to shift, not only physically, but spiritually out of exile mode. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
Many Ashkenazim are accustomed to postpone wearing a Tallit until they get married. What is the basis for this custom?
There are two separate statements in the Gemara, in the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Kiddushin, which are usually quoted in connection with this issue, and I'll mention them here briefly. The first is in the Talmud Bavli, Kiddushin, Daf Het Amud Aleph, and it states as follows, referring here to the Mitzvah of Pidyon Haben, the redeeming of the firstborn son from a Kohen. In other words, the father has to pay the Kohen the amount of money equal to five silaim, or give him something which is worth that amount. And it says in the Gemara, Kiron de kabel kohen ilawe. In other words, the Gemara is talking about something which is given to the Kohen by the father, even though it's not actually worth 5 silaim. The words of the Gemara, lo le'olam de la shaweh, something which is in fact not worth 5 silaim. Uchegon de kabel kohen ilawe. But the Kohen was willing to accept that item as being worth 5 silaim. In other words, to him, he said, to me it's worth 5 silaim, because as we know, that which is worth X to one person may be worth 2x to another person, depending on how much he wants or needs that object or that matter or that service. And therefore, the Gemara says that if a Kohen accepted an item and said, this to me is worth 5 silaim, so I consider this to be the value of 5 silaim, and therefore your son is redeemed, and I accept this article, then that is valid. And the Gemara goes on to give the example. Kihad Rav Kahana, as it once happened in the case of Rav Kahana, who was obviously a Kohen, Shakel Sudara, he accepted Sudar. A Sudar is a kind of a scarf that was wrapped around the head in a certain way to form a turban. So basically we could call it a turban that was worn as a headdress. Shakel Sudara mibe Pidyon Haben. He accepted a Sudar from the father as being worth 5 silaim, even though it was not actually worth that much. Amar Rav Asher. Rav Asher says about this, La amaran ela kehon Rav Kahana, ela kehon Rav Kahana. This is only true about someone like Rav Kahana. Why? De Gavra Rabbahu, because he is a great man, that is to say, a great Torah scholar. Umi ba'ile sudara areshe, and he is required to wear. In other words, it is expected of him. It's not a halachic requirement, but it is expected of him to wear a sudar, this kind of turban or headdress that was common in Bavel. We're talking here, of course, about Bavel. In Eretz Yisrael, apparently they had different kind of headdress, or perhaps no headdress at all. Certainly not a sudar. This was definitely a Babylonian, Persian kind of headdress, head covering. And Rav Asher says this is only true for someone like Rav Kahana, who requires such an item, and perhaps he was in need of such an item at that time. He didn't have one, he wanted a new one. And he said, therefore, this sudar that this father is offering me for the Pidyon Haben, to me it's worth 5 silaim. This way I don't have to go and find one. It's a nice one, I like it, it's appropriate, it suits my purpose, and therefore it is worth 5 silaim to me. So if a person can honestly say, this is worth 5 silaim to me, then it is considered to be so. But if a person, for example, has no call, no reason to wear such a sudar, in other words, to him it's really quite worthless, such a Kohen cannot say, I accept it upon me, I accept it as being worth 5 silaim, and therefore your son is redeemed. In that case, the Pidyon Haben is not valid. That is what Rav Asher says. So I read it again. Rav Asher says, Amar Rav Asher la amaran ela kehon Rav Kahana de Chavara Rabbahu. He's a great man, a great scholar, and he requires such a headdress. As Rashi says, Wala azel b'gilui harosh. A man such as Rav Kahana is not accustomed, it's not expected. He would never walk around without a head covering, which implies, by the way, as the Magen Avraham, as we will mention presently, points out that your average person, your average Jew in Bavel did not necessarily cover his head all the time at all. And therefore to Rav Kahana it was worth that amount. Aval kulei alama la, but not. This would not be true for everybody. Kiha, and they bring another example. Kiha demar bar Rav Asher, as it also happened in the case of the son of Rav Asher, who was also a Torah scholar. Zevan sudara me'ime de Rabba mikube. He once bought a sudar from the mother of Rabbah, or from the place, the town of Kube. Shaweh asara b'tleisar, even though it was only worth 10, he bought it for 13 of whatever currency it was, because to him it was worth that much, it was worth his while. So we see that sometimes a person purchases something for more than its market value, because to him it is worth more, it's more important to him. And in the same way, Rav Kahana could accept a sudar as such an item that is worth 5 slain. From this Gemara, it is understood that an important learned person, a Tamid Chachamim like Rav Kahana, it was common in Bavel for such people not to walk around, as Rashi says, b'gilui harosh, to walk about with their heads uncovered, and it was common for them to wear something called the sudara, or in Hebrew a sudar, which is a kind of a turban. That is one statement in the Talmud Bavli. The other statement of the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Kiddushin, is to be found on Daf Kaf Tait Amud Beth 29b, and here it states, Mishtabach le Rav Hisda le Rav Huna b'darav hamenona. It was once the case that Rav Hisda was speaking to Rav Huna. Rav Huna was the Gedol Hador, the greatest Chacham of his generation in Bavel, and Rav Hisda mentioned to him a young upcoming Torah scholar by the name of Rav Hamenona, and he said he praised him very highly. Da'adam Gadolhu, that he's a very great man, in other words, in Torah. Amale, said Rav Huna to Rav Hisda, when he next comes by to visit, or when he comes through town or something like that, Haviehu liyadi, bring him to me, I wish to meet him, I wish to speak to him. Ki atha, and it happened that he came to see him eventually. Hazie de la pares sudara. He saw that he, Rav Hamenona, Rav Huna, who was an older man, as we said, also the greatest Chacham of his generation, saw that Rav Hamenona was not wearing a turban, was not wearing a sudar on his head. Amar le mai ta'ama la paresat sudara. Why are you not wearing a sudar, a turban on your head? And here Rashi points out the question of Rav Huna was, why are you not wearing a sudar? Rashi says, Kederech ha-nesu'im shayuru ghilim lechasot roshan, because it was common for most people of his age, the age that Rav Hamenona was, we don't know exactly how old he was, but let's say for argument's sake he was a man in his early 20s. And most people at that age were married. And therefore it was common to see such a person wearing a turban. In other words, there was a connection in Bavel in those days between wearing this kind of headdress and being married. Normally an unmarried person, a young man who was not yet married, did not wear such a headdress, and a man who was married did do so. So he asked him, he was surprised, why are you not wearing a turban? And he apparently also suspected that he knew the answer, because he wasn't married. Amar le, he answered him, Rav Hamenona to Rav Huna, Dala nasivna, because I'm not married yet. Rav Huna was very angry when he heard this, because he considered it entirely improper and unacceptable that Rav Hamenona was not yet married, as is the discussion here in the Gemara about the age at which one should get married. He said to him, Ahadrinho la apeh mine. He turned his face away from him to show that he was angry and did not wish to speak to him any longer. Amar le hazeh de la hazeth laho la apai. Be careful, beware not to come and see me again. Do not appear before me again. Ad de nosevat, until you are married. And then the Gemara goes on to explain how Rav Huna was following his own dictum that a person has to be married by a certain age, and he saw that Rabbi Hamnonah was not married and he was of such an age. So we find here two Gemaroth, two statements in Masechet Kiddushin and the Talmud Bavli, both speaking about the wearing of a turban. From the first, on Daf Heth, we understand that wearing a turban was a sort of requirement, if not a halachic requirement, but a kind of social requirement for Talmidei Chachamim, certainly important Talmidei Chachamim, a person who was considered a Gavra Rabbah, a great man. And from that also we could understand that perhaps even grown men who were married, who were not Talmidei Chachamim, did not necessarily wear such a headdress. From the other Gemara on Daf Kaf Tet Amud Bet, we understand that there was a connection between wearing such a headdress, a turban, and being married. So it could be, in fact, that both conditions were usually required, so to speak. Again, we're not talking about an halachic obligation, but it seems that in those days, two of these conditions had to apply for the wearing of a turban to be fully expected, shall we say, to be almost, as it were, necessary. A, that a person be a Torah scholar of some note, and B, that he be married. Now, on the basis of this, the Beth Yosef already makes a certain connection in the Tur, in his Perush on the Tur Siman Heth. He makes a certain connection between these two Gemaroth, or at least the second Gemara that we quoted, and something which the Tur writes. And I'll quote briefly from the Tur. In Siman Heth, in Chof Sisith, the Tur writes, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Harosh, Ba'al Turim, writes, that having put the Sisith on, having put on wearing the Sisith, that a person should cover his head with the Tallit. The simple meaning of what the Tur writes, as the Gra explains in his Bir on the Shulchan Aruch here, is that it was not necessarily the case that a person wore what we call today a kippah or some kind of a hat. It wasn't always common. It's not necessary. It's not explicitly mentioned anywhere by the Chachamim that one must cover one's head at all times, even though today this is a standard practice, as we know, amongst all religious Jews. But it was not always considered to be such an obvious and necessary requirement. So the Tur explains or states that when a person puts on his talit, for davening at least, it's a good thing to have your head covered, and therefore you should cover your head with your talit, because it's assuming that you don't have anything else on your head. The Beth Yosef, already living in a different period of time, and assuming that it goes without saying that a Jew must have his head covered at all times, suggests that this is not the meaning, that the intention is that on top of whatever other head covering one might be wearing, it is expected or is proper to cover one's head with a talit as part of preparation for tefillah. And he quotes the Gemara that we just mentioned in Masechet Kiddushin, Daf Kaf Tet Amud Bet 29b, and he explains, and I quote just one line from the Beth Yosef, Upshita shelo hayu abahurim holechim berilui rosh mamash. It is obvious, says the Beth Yosef, that young men like Rav Hamnonah did not walk around bareheaded altogether. Ela wadai hainu sudar o talit. Here you will note for the first time we hear the mention of the word talit. He says it's obvious that it's referring to either a sudar, which we said is a kind of a turban, or a talit which is worn over the head, sheporasim ala rosh lesniuth. So we see here that the Beth Yosef is making an assumption, which is that a person must always have his head covered, and therefore that cannot be the meaning of the Tur when he refers to covering one's head with the talit. And B, he's making another assumption that which is stated in the Talmud in Kiddushin, Daf Kaf Tet Amud Bet, referring to Rav Hamnonah, who was not wearing a sudar. He says that it was common for married people to wear either a sudar or a talit. The obvious question, of course, is where does the Beth Yosef get the concept of talit? How does he bring the concept of talit into this discussion? There's no mention of a talit. It has nothing to do with a talit. He's talking about a headdress, some kind of hat or turban, which has nothing to do with a talit. One can wear a talit on one's body without covering one's head, and one can wear the talit whilst also using it to cover one's head. One can wear a talit in a number of ways, depending on the size and the shape of the talit, depending on the weather, whether you're hot, whether you're cold. A talit, there's no specific way in which one must wear a talit, and it doesn't necessarily have to cover one's head. And therefore it is surprising that the Beth Yosef makes any connection between these two things. Nevertheless, the fact is he does make such a connection, and this led the Magen Avraham to go even further. What we find then in the Magen Avraham on Seif Beth in Siman Heth in the Shulchan Aruch, where the Shulchan Aruch quotes the Torah and writes, "V'nachon sheyichaser rosho b'talit," it is proper that one covers one's head with a talit. The Magen Avraham writes that it is mashma from the Gemara in Kiddushin Daf Kafteth that we just mentioned, "Shebahur lo shelo nasa isha lo haya mechaser rosho b'talit afilu hu tamid chacham," that a young man, an unmarried young man, who even though he was a tamid chachamim, would not cover his head b'talit with a talit. Even though the Gemara, of course, as we just saw, does not speak about a talit at all. And then he goes on to say, with Daf Heth, that's the other Gemara we mentioned, Itha, it says, Demisha eno tamid chacham, he was not a tamid chacham, a Torah scholar, afilu nasui, even if he's married, lo haya mechaser rosho, would not usually cover his head. So, to sum up, what we have seen is as follows. We have two Gemaroth in Masechet Kiddushin, in the Talmud Bavli, one on Daf Heth and one on Daf Kafteth. On Daf Heth, it speaks of the custom of Talmidei Chachamim, like Rav Kahana, to wear a head covering. And it is therefore mashma from that Gemara, it seems, based on that a person who was not such a Talmid Chachamim, was not a great Torah scholar, would not necessarily wear a head covering at all. And this is exactly one of the conclusions of the Magen Avraham in Siman Heth, which, by the way, it should be pointed out, contradicts the assumption of the Beth Yosef. The Beth Yosef was assuming that it goes without saying that everyone's wearing some kind of head covering, and here we're talking about something additional when the Torah speaks about covering one's head with a talit, whereas the Magen Avraham is telling you, and quite correctly, that based on the Gemara and Daf Heth, in Kiddushin, it seems that only Talmidei Chachamim were expected always to cover their heads, and more average people did not necessarily do so. On top of that, we have the second statement on Daf Kaf Tetamud Beth, from where we see that even if a person was a Talmid Chachamim, it was not common to cover his head with a sudar, with a kind of turban, as was customary then in Bavel and in Persia, until he was married. And both the Beth Yosef and the Magen Avraham make some connection between this statement in the Gemara and Daf Kafteth and the Mitzvah of Tallit that we're discussing here in the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch Siman Heth. And this connection is entirely without basis, it must be said, and very, very strange indeed. And this is not just my conclusion. The Ya'bes, in his famous work Mor Uksi'ah on the Torah, here writes exactly these words, that the statement of the Magen Avraham is essentially incomprehensible because he is confusing a talit and a sudar, which are two different things. A sudar is a turban, a headdress, has nothing to do with the Mitzvah of Tzitzit, has nothing to do with any kind of a shawl or talit, which is talit is a kind of a shawl. There's no connection between the two. As I said before, one can wear a talit in a manner which involves covering one's head, or differently in a manner which does not involve covering one's head. This has nothing to do with what you wear or do not wear on your head, and has nothing to do with being married or not married. And therefore, even according to what the Magen Avraham writes, that it was customary for people in the time of the Talmud in Bavel to wear such and such a headdress or not to wear it in certain situations. This has absolutely nothing to do with wearing a talit in general, and certainly there's nothing to do with wearing a talit before being married. The Magen Avraham only says that it was not common for a person who was unmarried to wear such a headdress. But as I said, what does that have to do with wearing a talit? You could wear a talit, you could tell a person you're required to have a talit, just don't cover your head with it. If in fact that connection between that sugya and our discussion of talit and tzitzit is at all correct. there's actually no connection between these two issues, and it's a very, very strange set of assumptions and statements, both by the Beit Yosef and the Magen Avraham. And therefore the words of the Ya'bes are very correct. And this, of course, is the practice of much of the Jewish people, always has been. I can tell you that amongst the Temanim and amongst the Sfaradim, there is absolutely no connection made, no concept at all of connecting a person being married or not to wearing a talit. It is customary amongst the Temanim and the Sfaradim for very young boys already to wear a talit from a very young age, from the age of 6 or 7, shall we say. And I can also tell you that many Ashkenazim also have the same custom. I myself grew up in Ashkenazi communities where it was normal and customary for young boys from the age of 7 or 8 to wear a talit to shul, and that is what I myself did, and this was common practice amongst the Yekim, amongst the Jews who hailed from Germany, and therefore it's not even correct to say that this is a Ashkenazi minhag. It is more correct to say that this is perhaps the practice, and it's correct to point out this is a mistaken practice of some of the Ashkenazi Jews. And really there's no basis for it. It is proper and correct for all people to wear a talit from a very young age. Indeed, and this is exactly what we find in the Tosefta, in Masechet Hagirah, and it's quoted in the Talmud Bavli, in Masechet Sukkah Daf Membeth, where it says that a child, a young boy who knows how to wear a talit, who's capable of putting it on correctly and knowing how to behave in reasonable fashion whilst wearing a talit and not ripping it to pieces or getting it dirty or what have you, such a child the father is required to buy a talit for him to wear in order to train him in the mitzvah of tzitzit. This is written explicitly in the Tosefta, in the Talmud Bavli, in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in Masechet Sukkah. Also, there's no question about this, and this is quoted by the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Yod Zayin. This is quoted in the Rambam. There's no question, no safek about this whatever. So it's quite the opposite. The clear instruction of the Chachamim was that a father is required to buy for his young son from an age of approximately 7 years old or so, is required to buy for him a talit, so to train him in the kiyum and the practice of wearing tzitzit and performing this mitzvah. So to claim on the basis of these entirely unrelated gemaroth in Masechet Kiddushin that one should not do so is completely and utterly misguided. And there is one more point I need to make regarding this question of wearing a talit. It is correct for all people to wear a talit during tefillah, which specifically refers to the Shmoneh Esrei, to the Amidah, as the Rambam writes in Ilchot Tefillah Perek Hamishi, Halacha Hey, at the end he says, Derech kol hachamim u'talmidehem, it is the practice of all the hachamim and their students, shelo yitpalalu ela keshehen atufim, they only daven Shmoneh Esrei when they are covered in a talit with tzitzit. And the Rambam repeats this at the end of Hilchot Tzitzit, the end of Perek Gimel. He writes that it is proper L'olam yishtadel liyot atuf b'chsut ha'mechoyevet b'tzitzit. It is proper for a person to make every effort to be wearing at all times a beged, a garment which is hayav b'tzitzit, kadei she'yekayem misvah zod, in order to perform this misvah, and not to take advantage, as it were, of the loophole that if one does not wear such a garment, if one is not wearing a garment of 4 corners, then one is patur from tzitzit. And one particularly should be careful about doing so, about wearing this garment, this talit, when davening. And the Rambam adds, Genai gadolhu, it is a great embarrassment, literally, letamid chachamim, for a Torah scholar. And this also means, by the way, what we call today a ben Torah, like a bachur yeshiva, a person who studies Torah when he can. He goes to shiurim, even though he hasn't got very much time every day to learn, but he does the best he can. That is a tamid chachamim, person who follows the chachamim and takes their advice and follows their instruction. That is a Talmid Chachamim, not just a great Torah scholar. Rambam says, Genai Gadol is a great embarrassment for a Talmid Chachamim, sheitpalel v'hu eno atuf, for him to daven whilst not being covered in with a Tallit. So, in summary, the fact of the matter is quite the opposite. Not only is it not prohibited, asur, or improper in any way for an unmarried man to wear a tallit, it is in fact most definitely recommended, very strongly recommended. It's almost a hovah for every person to wear a tallit, married or unmarried, even from a very young age, as is explicitly mentioned by the Chachamim. This is a very dear and beautiful Mitzvah, and we should make every effort, and we should go out of our way to perform this Mitzvah as we are to do with all of the Mitzvot.
Does this only apply to Shacharit or to other tefillot as well?
There is absolutely no difference between Shacharit, morning prayers, and Minha or Musaf or any other tefillah. The Mitzvah of Tzitzit is a Mitzvah at all times, and it is a Mitzvah to be wearing a Tallit when one davens any of the tefillot, Shacharit, Musaf, Minha, and even Arvit in actual fact. Although with regards to Arvit, some might raise an eyebrow and say that Laila lo zaman tzitzit, that it is not a Mitzvah to wear tzitzit at night. In fact, this is also not at all a simple matter, and perhaps we'll discuss this in on a separate occasion. But certainly, according to many opinions, the Mitzvah of tzitzit does exist at night if one is wearing a garment which is normally worn during the day. That is to say, something which is not defined as pajamas or a night dress or something of that sort. So a tallit, which is worn very often, normally during the day, when worn at night, is also a garment which requires tzitzit and is perfectly proper and correct to wear it whilst davening Arvit as well.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.